He gave him the worst animal out of contempt. But when he saw what the horse did for the boy in front of everyone, he was left speechless. The alarm clock's shrill beeping pierced the darkness at 4:30 in the morning, and Miguel Ramirez's hand shot out from beneath the thin blanket to silence it before the sound could wake his grandmother. He lay still for a moment, staring at the water-stained ceiling of the trailer, listening to Carmen's labored breathing from the small bedroom they had partitioned off with a curtain. The rattling wheeze that accompanied each of her exhales had gotten worse in the past few weeks. Miguel slipped out of the fold-out couch that served as his bed, careful to avoid the creaky spots on the floor. The linoleum was cold beneath his bare feet as he moved to the kitchenette. He filled the kettle and set it on the stovetop, then pulled out his grandmother's pill organizer. The growing collection of orange prescription bottles beside it made his stomach tighten. Each one represented another bill they couldn't afford. As the water heated, Miguel glanced at the small shrine in the corner, a photograph of his parents, Roberto and Elena Ramirez, surrounded by candles and dried marigolds. In the picture, they stood proudly beside one of the thoroughbreds they had cared for at Willow Creek Farm. His father's hand rested protectively on his mother's shoulder, both of them smiling despite the exhaustion evident in their eyes. "Volveremos para la cena, mijo," his mother had promised on that final morning, just as she had hundreds of times before. "We'll be back for dinner." Except that day they never returned from their double shift. The rain-slicked roads and a truck driver who'd fallen asleep at the wheel had ensured that. The kettle began to whistle, and Miguel quickly lifted it off the burner. He prepared his grandmother's tea with honey and cinnamon, the way she liked it, and carried it with her morning pills to her bedside. "Abuela," he whispered, gently touching her shoulder. "Time for your medicine." Carmen's eyes fluttered open, momentarily confused before focusing on her grandson. "Tan temprano ya, mijo?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep and illness. "Sí, abuela. Early shift at school today." Miguel helped her sit up against the pillows and handed her the pills one by one, watching as she swallowed them with sips of tea. Carmen studied his face in the dim light. "You didn't sleep again?" Miguel shrugged. "I slept enough. 17-year-old boys should sleep more than 4 hours, she chided, but there was more worry than scolding in her tone. "Don't work too hard today at that stable." "It's not work, abuela, it's volunteering," Miguel smiled. "Besides, I like it there." An hour later, after leaving his grandmother with breakfast prepared and her inhaler within reach, Miguel pedaled his bicycle through the still dark streets of East Lexington. The neighborhoods gradually transformed from run-down trailer parks and weathered apartment complexes to the neat subdivisions and eventually the sprawling horse farms that made Kentucky famous. The contrast never failed to strike him, how quickly poverty gave way to prosperity in the space of a few miles. The high school parking lot was nearly empty when Miguel chained his bike to the rack. He had signed up for the early tutoring program, not because he needed academic help, but because it gave him access to the school's computers before classes started. Today, he needed to finish his essay on The Old Man and the Sea for English literature. In the quiet library, Miguel immersed himself in Hemingway's words about the old fisherman Santiago and his epic struggle. He had read the book 3 times already, drawn to the story of resilience against overwhelming odds. "An interesting interpretation, Mr. Ramirez," Mrs. Winters commented, suddenly appearing behind him. "But I think you're missing the significance of the marlin as a symbol." Miguel looked up at his English teacher. "I don't think it's just a symbol, Mrs. Winters. Santiago respects the marlin as another living being fighting for survival. That's why he calls it his brother." The teacher raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's certainly one perspective." She moved on without further comment, the slight dismissal so familiar that Miguel barely registered it anymore. When English class officially began 2 hours later, Miguel raised his hand during the discussion on Hemingway's themes of dignity and defeat. "Santiago says, 'A man can be destroyed but not defeated.' I think he means—" "Let's hear from someone else," Mrs. Winters interrupted, her gaze already moving to the other side of the room. "Jason, what did you think about that quote?" Miguel lowered his hand, his thoughts unspoken as Jason, the son of a local bank manager, offered an interpretation that Mrs. Winters praised effusively. It wasn't the first time his contributions had been overlooked, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. His accent marked him as an outsider, even though he had been born in Kentucky just like most of his classmates. When the final bell rang at 3 o'clock, Miguel felt the familiar sense of relief. He pedaled quickly to the far side of town, to the small community stable that had become his sanctuary over the past 3 years. Located on the outskirts of Lexington, where land was still affordable, Hope Stables was run by a retired veterinarian named Martha Gonzalez, who took in neglected and abandoned horses that no one else wanted. "Miguel, right on time," Martha called as he walked his bike through the gate. A stocky woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical braid. She was elbow-deep in a water trough, scrubbing algae from the sides. Destiny's been having trouble with her front hoof again. "Think you could take a look?" Of course. Miguel stored his backpack in the small office and rolled up his sleeves. The tension that had accumulated during the school day began to dissipate as he moved among the horses, checking water buckets and examining Destiny's tender hoof. The mare, a former carriage horse abandoned when she could no longer pull tourists through downtown, whickered softly as Miguel approached. He moved slowly, deliberately, his voice low and gentle as he ran his hands down her leg. "Patience is your gift," Martha commented, watching from the doorway of the stall. "No sudden movements, no demands. The horses sense it, especially the damaged ones." Miguel shrugged, not looking up as he carefully picked out a small stone that had become embedded in Destiny's frog. They just need someone to listen to them. "Tienes el don," his grandmother had told him the first time she saw him working with a nervous horse. "You have the gift. The dawn of hearing what isn't said." After 3 hours of mucking stalls, mending fences, and assisting Martha with medication for an elderly gelding, Miguel finally headed home. The spring twilight was settling over Lexington as he pedaled, the air filled with the scent of newly cut grass and distant rain. Carmen was sitting at their small kitchen table when he arrived, a newspaper spread out before her, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "Mijo, look at this," she said without preamble, pointing to a small advertisement. "The Whitfield Thoroughbred Farm is starting a program for young people from our community. Paid training, Miguel. Real jobs with one of the biggest breeding operations in Kentucky." Miguel scanned the advertisement, skepticism growing with each line. "Abuela, places like Whitfield don't hire people like us, except to clean stalls and mow lawns. It says here they're starting an inclusion program. $15 an hour, Miguel." Carmen's eyes were bright with hope. "That's almost twice minimum wage. With your experience—" "What experience? Volunteering at a rescue stable isn't the same as working with million-dollar thoroughbreds." "You understand horses better than anyone I know," Carmen insisted, her thin hand gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "And we need the money, mijo. My medicine—" She broke off as a coughing fit seized her, her entire body shaking with the effort. Miguel quickly fetched her inhaler, watching with a tightening chest as she struggled to breathe. When the attack finally subsided, she looked exhausted, the lines in her face deeper than ever. "I'll apply," he promised quietly. "First thing tomorrow." 3 days later, Miguel found himself at the imposing wrought iron gates of Whitfield Thoroughbred Farm, his best shirt ironed and his hair neatly combed. The main driveway stretched for nearly a mile, lined with pristine white fences and immaculate pastures where sleek thoroughbreds grazed on bluegrass. The contrast with Hope Stables was stark. Where Martha's rescue operation was functional but worn, everything at Whitfield gleamed with prosperity and prestige. The main stable building resembled a southern mansion more than a functional barn, with soaring ceilings, polished brass fixtures, and stall doors of rich mahogany. A secretary led Miguel to a wood-paneled office where Richard Whitfield sat behind an enormous desk. At 60, Whitfield had the weathered face of a man who had spent decades outdoors, but his hands were uncalloused, his fingernails manicured. The permanent downward turn of his mouth suggested a man accustomed to finding fault. "So," Whitfield said without bothering with introductions, "you're applying for our community program." He pronounced community as if it were a distasteful word. "Yes, sir," Miguel replied, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. I saw your advertisement. Experience with horses? Whitfield asked, barely glancing at the application form Miguel had carefully filled out. I've been volunteering at Hope Stables for 3 years, sir. It's a community rescue. I know what it is, Whitfield interrupted. Martha Gonzalez's little charity project. He leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze openly assessing. Those aren't horses, boy. They're projects of horses. Here we work with thoroughbreds worth more than your family's house. Miguel swallowed the insult, his grandmother's face flashing in his mind. He needed this job. I understand, sir. I'm a quick learner. After a few more pointed questions about Miguel's background and legal status, questions Miguel doubted were asked of other applicants, Whitfield seemed to come to a decision. You'll start Monday, 6 a.m. sharp. Jake Thompson, my head trainer, will assign your duties. Thank you, sir, Miguel said, relief washing through him. I appreciate the opportunity. Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course. That's what this program is all about. Opportunity. Monday morning arrived with a pre-dawn thunderstorm that soaked Miguel as he cycled to Whitfield Farm. Despite arriving 15 minutes early, he was met with immediate disapproval from Jake Thompson, a barrel-chested man with thinning red hair and permanent sunburn. You're the Mexican kid, Thompson said by way of greeting, looking Miguel up and down. Thought you people were supposed to be punctual. I'm Puerto Rican and Mexican-American, Miguel corrected quietly. And I'm 15 minutes early. Thompson's eyes narrowed. Well, aren't you special? Follow me. Instead of leading Miguel to the main stables where other workers were already busy with morning feeding, Thompson took him to a separate building set apart from the others. Unlike the showcase barn near the entrance, this structure was utilitarian and isolated. This is the recovery stable, Thompson explained as they entered, where we keep the problem cases. Inside, several grooms and exercise riders had gathered, exchanging knowing looks as Miguel followed Thompson down the center aisle. Miguel could feel their eyes on him, sense the anticipation in their postures. They stopped at the last stall, and Thompson gestured for the others to gather around. This is Midnight Thunder, he said, pointing to an enormous black stallion pressed against the back wall of the stall, ears flattened completely against his head, eyes reflecting pure terror and rage. 3 years ago, he was our champion. After a track accident that killed his jockey, no one can touch him anymore. He's bitten 3 handlers and broke a vet's arm last year. Miguel studied the magnificent animal, noting the scars on his flanks, the way his muscles trembled with tension. Why keep him? He asked. His value as a breeding stallion, Thompson replied with a shrug. But after 2 years trying to rehabilitate him, Mr. Whitfield is losing patience. If you fail, he'll probably be sent to slaughter. The casual cruelty of the statement made Miguel's stomach turn. The intention was clear. Richard Whitfield had given him an impossible task to ensure his failure. I'll need a few things, Miguel said quietly. Protective gear? Tranquilizers? Thompson asked with a sarcastic smile. A chair, Miguel replied, and maybe a book. The handlers exchanged confused looks as Miguel entered the stall carrying only a folding chair. He positioned it in the center of the space, his back to the stallion that snorted threateningly, and simply sat down. For an hour, Miguel just breathed, ignoring the mocking comments from the workers who had expected a show. Then, when the horse seemed to realize the intruder would make no threatening moves, Miguel began to sing softly in Spanish. It was an old Mexican lullaby his mother used to sing to him, A la puerta del cielo. The gentle voice filled the stable. Midnight Thunder, who had initially stamped his hooves in warning, gradually grew still. His ears, previously pinned to his head, moved slightly forward, catching the melody. On the second day, Miguel brought a worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea. He sat in the same position and began to read aloud, alternating between Spanish and English. A man can be destroyed but not defeated, he read, while the immense black horse watched silently from the corner. On the third day, something extraordinary happened. When Miguel finished reading, he remained seated in silence, setting the book aside. That's when he felt, more than heard, Midnight approaching from behind. The gathered workers held their breath, expecting an attack. But the enormous animal merely extended his muzzle, bringing it close to the back of the boy's neck, deeply inhaling his scent. "He recognizes another survivor," whispered Miguel, remaining perfectly still. "He recognizes another survivor," whispered Miguel, remaining perfectly still. The words hung in the air like mist at dawn. Behind him, Midnight Thunder's warm breath caressed the back of Miguel's neck, sending a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with fear. For several heartbeats, neither moved. The boy and the horse suspended in a moment of recognition that transcended language. When Miguel finally stood to leave at the end of his shift, the gathered stable hands dispersed, their expressions ranging from confusion to grudging curiosity. Only Luis, a weathered Mexican man in his 60s who had worked at Whitfield Farm for decades, lingered in the shadows, watching Miguel with knowing eyes. The ride home felt lighter somehow, as if Miguel had shed an invisible weight. Carmen was waiting at their small kitchen table when he arrived, her medication arranged beside a cup of cooling tea. "How was your first day, mijo?" she asked, studying his face for signs of disappointment or defeat. Miguel hung his worn jacket on the hook by the door and sat across from her. "I met a horse today, abuela, a thoroughbred named Midnight Thunder." "And?" Carmen prompted, sensing there was more. "He's like me," Miguel said simply. "He's lost people too." Carmen reached across the table to take his hand. Her fingers were thin but strong, calloused from decades of work. "Tienes el don, mijo," she said softly. "The gift of hearing what isn't said." Miguel squeezed her hand. "That's what you always tell me, because it's true." She coughed, a dry, rattling sound that had become the background music of their lives. "Your mother had it too. The horses at the farm would always calm when she approached, even the nervous ones." That night, Miguel dreamed of his mother standing in a sunlit paddock, her hand extended toward a dark shape that remained just beyond his vision. He woke before dawn with the melody of her lullaby echoing in his mind. The second day at Whitfield Farm, Miguel arrived carrying The Old Man in the Sea tucked under his arm. Jake Thompson intercepted him near the recovery stable, his expression a mixture of disbelief and mockery. "Whitfield is paying you to tame a horse, not start a book club," he said, eyeing the worn paperback. "You realize that, right?" "Yes, sir," Miguel replied, keeping his voice neutral. "I'm just trying a different approach." "Well, your different approach is the talk of the stable yard," Thompson said with a snort. "The betting pool on how long before that beast puts you in the hospital is up to $300. Miguel said nothing, simply waiting until Thompson stepped aside with a dismissive wave. "Your funeral, kid." Inside the recovery stable, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Instead of the crowd that had gathered the day before, expecting entertainment, only a few grooms lingered, their curiosity more genuine than malicious. Miguel nodded to them before entering Midnight's stall with the same folding chair. The great black stallion stood in the same corner, ears alert, but no longer flattened completely against his skull. His nostrils flared as he caught Miguel's scent. Miguel positioned his chair in the center of the stall, just as he had the day before, and began to read. His voice moved between Spanish and English, the rhythm of the languages creating a gentle cadence. "But man is not made for defeat," he said. "A man can be destroyed, but not defeated." Miguel paused, glancing briefly over his shoulder. Midnight had taken half a step forward, his attention fixed on the sound of Miguel's voice. "Un hombre puede ser destruido pero no derrotado," he repeated in Spanish, noticing how the horse's ears pricked forward at the familiar sounds. On the third day, Miguel brought his guitar, an old instrument that had belonged to his father. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, the strings not the best quality, but carefully tuned. When he began to play, the soft notes filled the stall like gentle rain. "Mi mamá decía que la música habla cuando las palabras fallan," Miguel said conversationally between songs, as though Midnight were an old friend sitting beside him. My mom said that music speaks when words fail, and that some hearts only open when we don't try to force them. He played songs his mother had taught him, Mexican folk melodies about love and loss, about journeys taken and homes left behind. He sang of mountains and rivers, of stars that guided travelers home. By the fourth day, a small audience had begun to gather discreetly outside the stall, during what they now called La Hora de Música, the music hour. Mostly Latino and African American workers, they would pause in their duties, drawn by the melodies that reminded many of them of distant homes. El chico tiene el toque, Luis commented quietly to another Mexican groom as they listened. The boy has the touch. Mi abuela would call it don de susurro, the gift of whisper. Word spread through the stable yard, eventually reaching Richard Whitfield's ears. On the fifth day, as Miguel sat reading to midnight, the stallion now standing just a few feet behind him, the stable door opened to reveal April Whitfield. Unlike her father, whose presence filled a room with tension, April moved quietly, a notebook and camera in hand. 23 and studying veterinary medicine at the University of Kentucky, April had her father's height, but her late mother's gentler features. She observed silently from outside the stall, making occasional notes as Miguel continued reading, seemingly unaware of her presence. When Miguel finally acknowledged her with a nod, she approached the stall door cautiously. "What you're doing is extraordinary," she said, keeping her voice low. "I'm documenting for my thesis on alternative methods of equine recovery." Miguel shrugged slightly. "I'm not doing anything extraordinary. I'm just letting him decide when he's ready." "That's precisely what's extraordinary," April replied. "Every trainer my father has hired has tried to dominate him, to break through his fear with force. You're the first to simply be with him." The next morning, Miguel arrived to find Midnight pacing nervously in his stall. A thunderstorm had passed through during the night, and the stallion's eyes rolled white with remembered terror. "The accident happened during a storm," Luis explained, appearing beside Miguel with a bucket of feed. "Lightning struck near the track. His jockey was thrown, trampled in the panic. They say Midnight tried to stay with him, even as the other horses fled." Miguel nodded, understanding more clearly now. "He's not dangerous. He's traumatized." "Tell that to the vet whose arm he broke," Luis replied, though without judgment. "Fear makes all of us dangerous, no?" That day, Miguel simply sat on the straw-covered floor, his back against the wall, and spoke softly about his own losses. He told Midnight about the rain-slicked road, about waiting for parents who never came home, about the suffocating silence that followed. "Sometimes I think grief is just love with nowhere to go," he said quietly. "Como un río sin mar, like a river without a sea." On the sixth day, Miguel brought a soft brush, placing it in the center of the stall before retreating to his usual position. The brush lay untouched between them as Miguel read and played music, a silent offering. Word of the Mexican boy who talked to horses continued to spread. Some of the more experienced trainers scoffed at what they called sentimental nonsense, but others watched with growing interest. The division largely fell along racial and class lines, the elite trainers and jockeys dismissive, the working-class grooms and exercise riders increasingly supportive. Luis became Miguel's unofficial guardian, quietly steering skeptics away from the recovery stable during Miguel's sessions and offering advice drawn from decades of horse experience. "Horses are like mirrors, mijo," he told Miguel during a lunch break. "They reflect what's inside you. Most people see their own fear reflected back and think the horse is mean or stubborn." On the seventh day, Miguel noticed Midnight investigating the brush that had remained in the center of the stall for 3 days. The stallion sniffed it cautiously, as though it might suddenly come alive. With deliberate slowness, Miguel rose from his chair and approached the brush. Every movement was telegraphed, every step measured. He picked up the brush and held it in his open palm, offering it to Midnight as one might offer an apple. The stable fell silent. The handful of workers who had been watching held their breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with agonizing slowness, Midnight extended his neck, stretching until his velvet muzzle was just inches from Miguel's hand. The stallion inhaled deeply, drawing in the scent of boy and brush together. And then, so briefly that some observers later questioned if they'd seen it at all, Midnight allowed the brush to touch his muzzle before retreating to his corner. A collective exhale rippled through the onlookers. "Did you see that?" whispered one of the younger grooms. "He let him touch him." Luis nodded, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile. El primer paso, the first step. Progress was not linear. The next day, a door slammed somewhere in the stable, and Midnight retreated to the furthest corner, trembling and defensive. All the previous day's advances seemed erased in an instant. Miguel simply sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and began to sing softly, the same lullaby he'd sung on the first day. He sang until the trembling subsided, until the wild look faded from Midnight's eyes. "It's okay to be afraid," Miguel told him. "Fear keeps us alive sometimes, but it can also keep us from living." By the end of the second week, Miguel had established a routine that the stable hands now respected implicitly. From 7 to 8 each morning, no one slammed doors, shouted, or made sudden movements near the recovery stable. They called it tiempo tranquilo, quiet time. During one of these sessions, April Whitfield returned, this time with a small camera. She gestured questioningly, and Miguel nodded permission. "Just no flash," he whispered. She positioned herself discreetly outside the stall and began to document what was happening between boy and horse. The quiet communion, the gentle offerings of music and story, the gradual diminishing of space between them. On the 15th day, something extraordinary happened. While Miguel read from The Old Man and the Sea, Midnight gradually moved closer, step by cautious step, until he stood directly behind the chair. The stable hands watching froze, some instinctively reaching for pitchforks or brooms, expecting the worst. But instead of attacking, Midnight simply lowered his great head and inhaled deeply, his muzzle inches from Miguel's dark hair. For 5 heartbeats, they remained that way, the boy continuing to read as though nothing unusual were happening, the horse breathing in his scent. When Miguel finally closed the book and set it aside, he remained perfectly still, every nerve in his body aware of the powerful presence behind him. "He recognizes another survivor," he whispered, as Midnight's breath warmed the back of his neck. The soft brush lay in Miguel's open palm, as Midnight Thunder's velvet muzzle hovered just above it, their breath mingling in the cool morning air of the stable. Neither moved, suspended in a moment that stretched like taffy. Then, as if making a profound decision, Midnight allowed his muzzle to brush against the bristles for a heartbeat, before retreating to his corner, ears forward, watching. Miguel maintained his neutral expression, but inside, his heart soared. This wasn't just progress. It was a declaration of possibility. The next morning, Miguel arrived at the stable carrying the same soft brush. He found Midnight pacing along the back wall, agitated by something unseen. Instead of immediately approaching, Miguel sat cross-legged on the straw, placed the brush beside him, and opened his book. "Today we'll try something different," he said softly. "Sometimes we move forward, sometimes we need to pause. Both are okay." 3 days passed with the brush as a silent companion between them. Miguel would read, play music, and occasionally speak to Midnight about inconsequential things, the way the morning light filtered through the stable windows, how his abuela had taught him to make perfect tortillas, the dream he'd had about swimming in a clear mountain river. Midnight observed from his corner, sometimes pacing, sometimes standing still, but always listening. On the 4th day, as Miguel played a gentle melody on his guitar, he noticed Midnight approaching the brush that lay at the center of the stall. The stallion lowered his head, nostrils flaring as he investigated the object. With deliberate slowness, Miguel set his guitar aside and rose. Every movement was telegraphed, his eyes soft but never staring directly at the horse. He picked up the brush and extended it on his open palm. "Would you like to try again?" he asked quietly. For a long moment, Midnight stood frozen, muscles tense beneath his midnight coat. Then, with exquisite caution, he extended his neck and allowed the brush to touch his muzzle again, this time for several seconds before withdrawing. Word of this milestone spread quickly through the stable yard. That afternoon, as Miguel filled a water bucket outside Midnight's stall, Richard Whitfield appeared, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the concrete floor. "I hear you've made progress," he said, his tone suggesting anything but approval. "Small steps, sir," Miguel replied, keeping his voice neutral. Midnight is starting to trust a little. Richard's eyes narrowed. "I'm not paying for small steps, boy. I need results. That horse represents a significant investment. Trust takes time, Mr. Whitfield. Time is money." Richard glanced toward the stall where Midnight watched them warily. "I've got buyers interested in his bloodline, but they need to see a functional stallion, not a glorified pasture ornament that allows a brush to touch his nose." Before Miguel could respond, April appeared at the stable entrance, her notebook in hand. "Dad, I've been documenting Miguel's work for my thesis. The approach he's using is backed by recent research on equine trauma recovery." Richard's expression darkened. "April, stop wasting time with this sentimental nonsense. Your degree should focus on practical veterinary applications, not whatever this is." He gestured dismissively toward Miguel and Midnight's stall. "Evidence-based behavioral rehabilitation is practical," April countered. "And what Miguel is achieving, what he's achieving is taking too long," Richard interrupted. "I want results, a halter, basic commands, normal horse behavior. Otherwise, I'll find someone who can deliver." After Richard stalked away, April turned to Miguel with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry about that. He sees horses as commodities, not beings with their own experiences." Miguel nodded, unsurprised. Most people don't understand trauma. They think recovery should follow a schedule. That evening, Miguel cycled home with Richard's ultimatum weighing on his shoulders. He found the trailer dark, except for the glow of a television in the neighbor's window. The note on the kitchen table made his blood run cold. Carmen had another episode. Took her to St. Joseph's. Come when you can. Mrs. Vasquez. The hospital waiting room was harshly lit, the vinyl chairs uncomfortable beneath Miguel as he waited for news. Mrs. Vasquez, their elderly neighbor, sat beside him, her hands worrying a worn rosary. "She couldn't breathe, mijo," she explained. "I heard her calling through the window. By the time I got inside, she was blue around the lips." 3 hours later, a tired doctor emerged. "Ms. Ramirez is stabilized, but her COPD is progressing faster than we'd like. She needs a new medication regimen, more aggressive, more specialized." "Will insurance cover it?" Miguel asked, already knowing the answer. The doctor's expression said everything. "Some components. Others will be challenging." In the sterile hospital room, Carmen looked small and fragile against the white sheets, an oxygen mask covering half her face. When she saw Miguel, she tried to smile, then gestured for him to come closer. "No te preocupes, mijo," she whispered when he leaned in. "I'm just tired. I'll be fine." Miguel held her thin hand, noting how the skin had grown more translucent, the veins more prominent. "You need better medicine, abuela," the doctor said. "Doctors always want to give more medicine," she interrupted. "What I need is for you to keep your job. The insurance, Miguel. We need it." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Miguel's shoulders as he rode his bicycle back to the trailer at midnight. Without his job at Whitfield Farm, they would lose the small insurance coverage that came with it. Without insurance, Carmen's condition would deteriorate even faster. When Miguel arrived at the stable the next morning, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. Luis was waiting for him with a thermos of coffee. "Rough night?" the older man asked, noting Miguel's exhaustion. Miguel nodded, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. "My grandmother is in the hospital. Breathing problems." Luis's weathered face creased with concern. "Lo siento, mijo. Is there anything we can do?" The simple offer of help, the "we" that implied a community behind him, nearly broke Miguel's composure. He swallowed hard before responding. Just pray for her, I guess. Later that morning, Richard Whitfield summoned Miguel to his office. The mahogany-paneled room with its hunting trophies and equestrian memorabilia felt a world away from the working stables. "I've been more than patient," Richard began without preamble. 2 weeks, and all that horse will allow is occasional touching with a brush. My previous trainers had halters on difficult horses in days, not weeks. "And where are those horses now, sir?" Miguel asked quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not the point. The point is, I need to see concrete progress. 1 week, Ramirez. Get a halter on that horse, have him accepting basic handling, or find another job." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, its implications crystal clear. Miguel thought of Carmen in the hospital bed, of the medication she needed, of the insurance that came with his employment. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I understand." That afternoon, Miguel entered Midnight's stall with heavier steps than usual. The weight of Richard's demands and Carmen's illness pressed down on him like a physical burden. He sat on the straw, back against the wall, too exhausted to even open his book. Midnight observed him from the opposite corner, ears pricked forward in curiosity at the change in routine. Miguel closed his eyes, feeling tears threatening to spill. He couldn't afford to lose this job, but he also couldn't force Midnight to progress faster than the horse was ready. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, more to himself than to Midnight. "He wants results, I can't promise." The weight of it all, Carmen's illness, Richard's ultimatum, the precariousness of their existence, finally overwhelmed him. Silent tears tracked down his cheeks as Miguel pulled his knees to his chest, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to burst free. A soft nickering sound broke through his distress. Miguel opened his eyes to find Midnight standing closer than he'd ever voluntarily come before, head lowered, watching him with what could only be described as concern. "Are you checking on me?" Miguel asked softly, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Midnight took another cautious step forward, then another, until he stood just an arm's length away. Then, in a gesture that left Miguel breathless, the great black stallion extended his muzzle and gently touched Miguel's shoulder with his nose. The touch lasted only seconds, but its significance was monumental. Midnight had initiated contact, had chosen to approach, to offer what felt remarkably like comfort. "Gracias, amigo," Miguel whispered, remaining perfectly still. "I needed that." The next morning, a small crowd of stable hands had gathered by the time Miguel arrived. Luis approached him with an envelope. "It's not much," the older man said, pressing it into Miguel's hand. "But all of us wanted to help with your abuela's medical bills." Miguel opened the envelope to find several $100s in cash, small bills and even coins, clearly gathered from people who had little to spare themselves. "I can't," he began, emotion catching in his throat. "Yes, you can," Luis interrupted gently. "Somos comunidad. We are community." With renewed determination, Miguel entered Midnight's stall carrying both the brush and, for the first time, a light halter. He placed both items in the center of the straw, then retreated to his usual position against the wall. Instead of reading, Miguel simply talked, his voice low and melodic as he shared stories of his parents, of Carmen, of the community that had surprised him with their generosity. As he spoke, Midnight moved gradually closer, drawn perhaps by the emotional openness in Miguel's voice. When the stallion stood beside the halter and brush, Miguel slowly rose and approached. With movements as fluid as water, he picked up the brush and, after receiving Midnight's permission through a subtle lowering of the great head, began to gently brush the stallion's neck. 5 minutes passed in absolute silence, as the small audience outside the stall watched in amazement. Midnight stood still, accepting Miguel's touch for the longest period yet, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be contentment. When Miguel finally stepped back, Midnight remained where he was, seemingly relaxed in the center of the stall. It was a breakthrough that even the most skeptical observers couldn't deny. That evening, while Miguel left the stable exhausted but hopeful, April intercepted him with an urgent expression. I overheard my father on the phone, she whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed. He filed an insurance claim after Midnight's accident, collecting a substantial sum for permanent damage to a valuable breeding stallion. If Midnight shows significant recovery, he could face fraud charges, and I think he plans to get rid of both of you before that happens. April's words hit Miguel like a physical blow. Insurance fraud, he whispered, glancing back toward the stable where Midnight stood. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Richard's impatience, his dismissal of slow progress, his insistence on quick results or abandonment of the project altogether. He collected nearly $500,000, April confirmed, her voice barely audible. The policy covered permanent psychological damage, rendering the animal unfit for breeding or competition. Your success threatens that claim. Miguel leaned against his bicycle, legs suddenly weak. What can I do? If I leave, what happens to Midnight? April's expression darkened. Nothing good. Dad's not the type to leave loose ends. That night, Miguel barely slept. He lay on the fold-out couch, staring at the water-stained ceiling of the trailer, his mind racing. Carmen had been released from the hospital with new prescriptions that cost more than their monthly rent. Without his job at Whitfield Farm, without the insurance it provided, her condition would deteriorate rapidly. But now he understood the impossible position he was in. Success with Midnight might lead to his dismissal to cover up the insurance fraud. Failure would definitely result in Midnight being disposed of, and Miguel losing his job anyway. Before dawn, Miguel's phone vibrated with a text message from Luis. Be careful today, eyes everywhere. We are watching too. The cryptic message made sense when Miguel arrived at the stable to find several Latino and African American workers strategically positioned around the recovery area. They acknowledged him with subtle nods as he passed, their presence a silent promise of protection. Inside, Miguel found Midnight unusually alert, ears pricked forward as if sensing the tension in the air. Buenos dias, amigo, Miguel said softly. You feel it too, don't you? The storm coming. He placed the halter in the center of the stall once again, then settled against the wall with his guitar. Today he played melancholy ballads, songs of separation, of journeys taken against one's will, of returning home. His fingers moved across the strings with practiced ease, his voice barely above a whisper. My parents used to sing this one, he told Midnight between songs, about a bird that flies between two homes, never fully belonging to either. Midnight approached cautiously, standing closer than ever before. When Miguel finally set the guitar aside, the stallion remained nearby, his dark eyes fixed on the boy's face, as if truly listening. Luis appeared at the stall door, his expression guarded. Jake is bringing some buyers through in 20 minutes, Richard's orders. Miguel nodded his understanding. The timing was suspicious. Richard knew this was Miguel's designated quiet time with Midnight. Gracias, he said, rising slowly to his feet. When Jake Thompson appeared with two men in expensive suits, Miguel was sitting cross-legged on the straw, the brush in his lap, Midnight standing voluntarily beside him. The stallion's ears flattened immediately at the intrusion. This is the problem case I mentioned, Jake said to the visitors, his tone deliberately loud. We've had a kid working with him, but progress is minimal. Mr. Whitfield is considering other options. Miguel kept his expression neutral, but his heart raced. Were these men from slaughterhouses or foreign buyers looking for cheap breeding stock? Either way, they represented a threat to Midnight. As if sensing Miguel's distress, Midnight took a step closer to him, his massive body positioning slightly between the boy and the visitors. The gesture wasn't lost on Jake, whose eyes narrowed. Seems attached to the Mexican kid, one of the men commented. Temporary fixation, Jake dismissed. Happens sometimes with troubled animals. They imprint on whoever feeds them regularly. After they left, Miguel released a shaky breath. That was close, amigo, he whispered to Midnight. Too close. That afternoon, Miguel found April waiting for him outside the stable, her expression troubled. Dad's bringing in specialists for the Derby weekend, she said without preamble. He's planning some kind of demonstration to impress international investors. With Midnight? Miguel asked, alarmed. April nodded. He's told them about our innovative rehabilitation techniques. They're expecting to see results, a recovered champion stallion. But that contradicts his insurance claim, Miguel said, confusion evident in his voice. Exactly, which is why I think he plans to get rid of you before then and have someone else take credit for any progress. Miguel's hands clenched involuntarily. They'll destroy everything we've built. Midnight trusts me. A new handler, different methods. It would traumatize him all over again. That evening, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, Miguel visited Carmen at their trailer. She sat at the kitchen table, her new medications arranged in neat rows before her, the cost of each one a silent accusation. El cielo está enojado, Carmen commented, looking out at the gathering storm. The sky is angry. So am I, abuela, Miguel admitted, sinking into the chair across from her. The Whitfields, they're not good people. Carmen studied her grandson's face. What happened, mijo? Miguel explained the situation in halting sentences. The insurance fraud, the threatened dismissal, the danger to Midnight. Carmen listened silently, her weathered hands folded before her. Life has never been fair to people like us, she finally said, but that doesn't mean we accept injustice when we see it. What choice do I have? Miguel asked, despair creeping into his voice. We need the money, the insurance. There are always choices, Miguel. Carmen's eyes, though tired, were fierce with conviction. Your parents didn't raise you to look away from wrongdoing, even when standing up has a cost. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Miguel cycled back to the farm later that evening. The storm that had threatened all day was finally breaking, and the first heavy raindrops pelted his face as he pedaled faster. He had promised Luis he would check on Midnight one more time before the storm hit in full force. The stable yard was eerily quiet when he arrived, most workers having departed early due to the weather. Miguel slipped through the side entrance, guided by the beam of his flashlight. Inside the recovery stable, the horses were already restless, sensing the approaching storm. Distant lightning illuminated the windows, followed seconds later by growling thunder. Miguel hurried to Midnight's stall, finding the stallion pacing nervously, eyes wide with remembered fear. It's okay, amigo, Miguel soothed, entering the stall without hesitation. I'm here. Nothing bad will happen. But as the words left his mouth, a tremendous crack split the air, lightning striking dangerously close to the stable. The building shuddered, and the horses erupted in panic. Whinnies and the sound of hooves striking wood filled the air as terror spread through the confined space. Midnight reared, eyes wild with fear. Miguel spoke steadily, trying to keep his voice calm despite his racing heart. I know, he said. The storm is scary, but I'm here with you. Another lightning strike, even closer, and this time Miguel felt the electricity in the air. The stable lights flickered and died, plunging the space into darkness broken only by sporadic flashes through the windows. Easy, Miguel continued, moving slowly toward Midnight, who had pressed himself against the back wall, trembling violently. Remember our breathing, in and out, just like we practiced. A deafening crack shook the entire structure, lightning striking the old oak beside the stable. Miguel heard a splintering sound above as a support beam, weakened by years of neglect, partially gave way. He looked up just in time to see it falling, tried to move, but not quickly enough. Pain exploded across his shoulder and head as the beam struck him, driving him to his knees. Warm blood trickled down his temple as the stable swam before his eyes. Through the haze of pain, he was vaguely aware of shouts, of people running toward the stable. Miguel, where are you? Luis's voice called urgently. Miguel tried to respond, but his voice failed him. He slumped sideways, consciousness slipping away despite his efforts to remain awake. Through the fog descending over his mind, Miguel became aware of movement beside him. Midnight, who had been paralyzed with terror moments before, now positioned himself over Miguel's fallen form. The stallion's legs straddled the boy protectively, and a warning sound, part snort, part squeal, erupted from his throat as Luis and two other workers appeared at the stall door. Dios mío, Luis breathed, taking in the scene. He's protecting him. We need to get Miguel out, another worker urged. That head wound looks bad. But when they tried to enter the stall, Midnight bared his teeth, positioning himself more firmly over Miguel's body. Each approach was met with increasingly threatening postures from the stallion. It's like he thinks we're going to hurt the boy, one worker said in disbelief. Luis held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. Wait, he said. April is coming. She called a vet. Let's not make things worse. Through waves of semi-consciousness, Miguel was aware of the warm presence above him, of the fierce protection being offered by the very creature others had feared and condemned. Despite the pain and confusion, a single clear thought formed in his mind. Midnight was returning the favor, keeping him safe as he had tried to do for the horse. Minutes that felt like hours passed. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the stall, a different kind of standoff unfolded. Midnight maintained his protective stance over Miguel, refusing access to anyone who approached. Finally, April's voice cut through the haze. I've called an ambulance, she said from the stall door, but we need to get him out of there. The horse won't let anyone near him, Luis explained. He's protecting Miguel, April said, and Miguel could hear the emotion in her voice even through his fog. It's extraordinary. He felt her presence move closer, heard her speak softly to Midnight. We want to help him, she explained to the horse. He needs medical attention. To everyone's surprise, Midnight's posture softened slightly at the sound of April's voice. The stallion had become accustomed to her presence during her documentation visits. He still stood over Miguel, but his aggressive stance had moderated. I'm going to try something, April said. Miguel heard the familiar click of her camera turning on. Then her voice, gentle but clear. Miguel, if you can hear me, say something to Midnight. Let him know it's okay. Through cracked lips, Miguel managed to whisper, Está bien, amigo. They're friends. The simple phrase seemed to penetrate Midnight's protective instinct. The stallion stepped back just enough for April and Luis to enter the stall and kneel beside Miguel. As they carefully assessed his injuries, Miguel drifted in and out of awareness. Through his mental fog, he registered April's voice speaking urgently into her phone. Yes, I'm filming it right now, she was saying. This changes everything, Miguel. My father can't deny what's happening here anymore, but he also won't simply accept it. The sunrise painted the hospital room in hues of amber and gold as Miguel opened his eyes, wincing at the dull throb in his head. A butterfly bandage held together the gash on his temple, and his shoulder ached beneath layers of gauze. April sat in a plastic chair beside the bed, her camera resting in her lap, eyes fixed on the small television mounted in the corner. You're awake, she said, noticing his movement. The doctor says you have a mild concussion and a deep cut, but nothing's broken. Miguel's memories of the previous night rushed back, the storm, the falling beam, and most vividly, Midnight standing over him, protecting him from perceived threats. The video, he said, voice hoarse. You were filming. April nodded, turning her camera so he could see the small display screen. I recorded everything. Midnight protecting you, refusing to let anyone approach, then responding to your voice even when you were barely conscious. She hesitated. Miguel, this is incredible footage. It completely contradicts the narrative that Midnight is dangerous and irredeemable. The hospital door swung open, and Richard Whitfield strode in, his tall frame dominating the small room. His expression was unreadable as he glanced from Miguel to his daughter. Well, he said, his voice measured. That was quite a dramatic episode last night. April stood, positioning herself subtly between her father and Miguel's bed. I was just showing Miguel the footage of Midnight's behavior during the storm. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, I've seen it. Remarkable instinct, almost like a guard dog. Not a guard dog, Miguel corrected quietly. A friend. He was protecting me. Richard studied Miguel with new intensity, as if recalculating his value. Perhaps, he conceded. Either way, it's generated quite a buzz around the farm. Several staff members witnessed it, and apparently word travels fast. And how does that affect your insurance claim? April asked pointedly. A flash of anger crossed Richard's face before his expression smoothed into practiced neutrality. My primary concern is the safety of my employees and the welfare of a valuable animal, he replied smoothly. Which reminds me, I've arranged for your medical expenses to be fully covered, Miguel. The accident occurred on Whitfield property, after all. The abrupt shift to generosity made Miguel instantly suspicious. Thank you, he said cautiously. Richard moved to the window, gazing out at the hospital parking lot. Once you're recovered, we should discuss your future at Whitfield Farm. Your approach with Midnight has been unorthodox, but clearly there's something to it. After Richard departed, April exhaled slowly. That's not the reaction I expected. He's adapting, Miguel said, like any good predator when the environment changes. 2 days later, Miguel returned to Whitfield Farm, his head still bandaged, but cleared for light duty. The atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Grooms and exercise riders greeted him with newfound respect, some even stopping to ask about his techniques with Midnight. News of the stallion's protective behavior had transformed Miguel from an oddity to a curiosity. When he reached the recovery stable, Luis was waiting, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. The conquering hero returns, he said, embracing Miguel carefully to avoid his injured shoulder. Hardly a hero, Miguel replied. How's Midnight? Anxious. Hasn't eaten properly since you left. Keeps watching the door. Inside the stall, Midnight stood alert, ears pricked forward. The moment he caught Miguel's scent, he nickered softly. A sound Miguel had never heard from him before. The greeting struck him like a physical force, warming something deep inside his chest. Hola, amigo, Miguel said quietly. I missed you too. As Miguel settled into his usual spot against the wall, he noticed a new halter hanging outside the stall, expensive leather with the Whitfield brand embossed on the cheekpiece. A message from Richard, perhaps, a reminder of expectations. Midnight approached without hesitation, lowering his great head to sniff the bandage on Miguel's temple, his breath warm against the boy's skin. There was a new quality to the stallion's demeanor, a protectiveness that hadn't been there before the storm. We survived together, Miguel murmured, carefully reaching up to touch Midnight's neck. That changes things, doesn't it? Later that afternoon, Richard appeared at the recovery stable with an entourage, a photographer from the Blood Horse magazine, a videographer, and a man introduced as Dr. Williams, an equine behavior specialist from a prestigious Kentucky veterinary practice. Miguel watched warily as they approached Midnight's stall. Here he is, Richard announced, his voice carrying the practiced charm he reserved for business associates. Midnight Thunder, former track champion, now the centerpiece of Whitfield Farm's innovative rehabilitation program. The specialist studied Midnight with professional interest. Remarkable progress, based on what I've heard of his previous condition. How long have you been working with this approach, Mr. Whitfield? Before Miguel could register what was happening, Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that appeared collegial but felt possessive. Our team has been developing these methods for some time, Richard replied smoothly. Miguel here has been instrumental in the hands-on implementation. The photographer snapped several pictures of Richard and Miguel standing beside Midnight's stall, the stallion unusually calm despite the strangers and flashing camera. When the magazine representatives departed, Dr. Williams remained behind. I'd like to observe your methods directly, he said to Miguel. If Mr. Whitfield approves, of course. Richard nodded magnanimously. Of course. Full transparency. That's the Whitfield way. The following morning, Miguel found Dr. Williams already waiting at Midnight's stall, notebook in hand. The specialist observed silently as Miguel went through his routine. Soft music, quiet reading, gentle conversation. Fascinating, Dr. Williams commented afterward. You're using techniques similar to those being developed at some progressive equine therapy centers, though your application is quite intuitive. Have you had formal training? Miguel shook his head. Just experience at a rescue stable and what my parents taught me. Well, you have a gift, the specialist said, making another note. With proper scientific framework applied to your instinctive approach, this could be quite revolutionary. That evening, Miguel cycled to the hospital to visit Carmen, who had been readmitted after another breathing episode. She looked smaller against the white hospital sheets, her skin ashen beneath its natural brown tone. Don't look so worried, mijo, she said, patting his hand. The doctors say it's just a precaution. Miguel forced a smile. I brought good news. My job is secure, and Mr. Whitfield is covering my medical expenses from the accident. Carmen's eyes narrowed slightly. Why this sudden generosity? Because Midnight protected me during the storm. April caught it on video, and now everyone's talking about it. Miguel hesitated. But Whitfield is taking credit for the rehabilitation program, calling it the Whitfield method in a magazine interview. Carmen was silent for a moment, then asked, Does it matter who gets credit if Midnight is saved? Miguel considered this. I don't know, maybe not. When Miguel returned to the farm the next day, he found a glossy equestrian magazine on his chair in the tack room. Someone had opened it to a 2-page spread featuring Richard Whitfield standing proudly beside Midnight's stall. The headline read, Innovation at Whitfield Farm, Revolutionary Equine Rehabilitation Techniques. Miguel's name appeared once in the last paragraph, described as one of the young handlers involved in the program. Luis appeared in the doorway, watching Miguel's reaction. Quite a story, he said neutrally. Miguel closed the magazine. It's just words on paper. Words that sell horses and bring investors, Luis pointed out. Words that could make a man like Richard Whitfield millions. Over the next several days, a parade of visitors disrupted the quiet routine Miguel had established with Midnight. Veterinarians, horse trainers, and wealthy farm owners all came to observe the Whitfield method firsthand. Each time Richard presented Miguel as a member of our specialized team, never acknowledging that the approach had been Miguel's from the beginning. More troubling was the constant presence of Dr. Williams, who had begun making suggestions for improving the rehabilitation process. Each day, he arrived with new equipment, special halters, sensory tools, recording devices to document progress scientifically. We should introduce more structured interaction periods, Dr. Williams advised, consulting his clipboard. Measured responses to stimuli, recorded at 15-minute intervals. Miguel could see Midnight growing increasingly agitated by the disruptions and unfamiliar objects. He needs consistency and calm, Miguel argued. Too many changes too quickly will set us back. The scientific method requires measurable parameters, Dr. Williams insisted. Mr. Whitfield agrees. One afternoon, April found Miguel in the feed room, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. They're taking over everything, he said without preamble. Your father, Dr. Williams, they're pushing their methods on Midnight without understanding what he needs. April nodded grimly. It gets worse. I overheard Dad on the phone with investors from Japan and Dubai. They're coming for Derby weekend to see Midnight's miraculous recovery firsthand. Dad's planning a special demonstration. Midnight isn't ready for that kind of pressure, Miguel protested. I know, but Dad sees dollar signs, not just from selling Midnight once he's rehabilitated, but from licensing the Whitfield method to other farms. April hesitated. There's more. The investors specifically mentioned being interested in your techniques after Dad sent them my early footage. But he's positioning Dr. Williams to take your place during the demonstration. The implications settled heavily on Miguel's shoulders. Richard was systematically removing him from the narrative while capitalizing on his work. Soon, he would be completely sidelined, or worse, dismissed once his usefulness ended. That night, Miguel found a notice in his locker. Effective immediately, all sessions with Midnight would be supervised by Dr. Williams or another appointed specialist. For documentation purposes, no unauthorized interaction was permitted. When Miguel arrived the next morning, he found Dr. Williams already with Midnight, attempting to introduce a complicated training halter equipped with sensors. The stallion had retreated to the back of the stall, ears flattened, eyes showing white. "He doesn't like that," Miguel said from the doorway. "You're pushing too fast." Dr. Williams barely glanced up. "This is standard equipment for behavioral modification. He'll adjust." Miguel watched Midnight's growing distress, the way his muscles trembled beneath his sleek coat, the same signs he'd shown when Miguel first began working with him. Months of careful trust building were being systematically dismantled. "You're undoing everything we've accomplished," Miguel insisted, stepping into the stall. "Mr. Whitfield has authorized this approach," Dr. Williams replied stiffly. "Perhaps you should focus on your other duties." Before Miguel could respond, Richard appeared behind him. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone deceptively light. Miguel turned to face him directly. "Yes, sir, there is. Midnight is showing clear signs of distress with these new methods. He needs consistency and trust, not gadgets and forced interaction." Richard's expression hardened. "Dr. Williams is a recognized expert in equine behavior. His methods are scientifically proven." "Science without compassion isn't helping Midnight," Miguel countered. "You can see he's regressing." For a moment the two stood in tense silence, the power dynamic between them palpable. Then Richard smiled thinly. "Starting tomorrow, you're transferred to the main stables. Midnight is now under Dr. Williams's exclusive professional supervision. Consider yourself promoted. Starting tomorrow, you're transferred to the main stables. Midnight is now under Dr. Williams's exclusive professional supervision. Consider yourself promoted." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Miguel stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides to keep them from trembling. Around him, the stable seemed to contract, the walls pressing closer, the air growing thick. Midnight shifted nervously in his stall, picking up on the tension radiating from Miguel. "Mr. Whitfield, please," Miguel said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Midnight needs consistency. Changing handlers now will undo months of progress." Richard's smile never reached his eyes. "The decision is final, Ramirez. Report to Jake tomorrow morning at 6. He'll assign your new duties." With that, he turned and walked away, Dr. Williams following in his wake after shooting Miguel a look of smug triumph. When they were gone, Miguel approached Midnight's stall. The stallion had retreated to the back corner, ears flattened against his head, eyes wide with confusion and distress. "Lo siento, amigo," Miguel whispered, pressing his forehead against the stall door. "I'm so sorry." That evening, Miguel cycled home with leaden legs, each pedal stroke an effort. The small trailer looked even more depressing than usual, its faded aluminum siding peeling in places, the concrete blocks supporting one corner sinking unevenly into the soil. With Carmen still in the hospital, the silence inside was absolute. Miguel heated a can of beans for dinner, but the food turned to ash in his mouth. He could think only of Midnight, alone in his stall, surrounded by strangers with their gadgets and aggressive methods. After 3 bites, he pushed the plate away and buried his face in his hands. His phone buzzed, a text from April. "Don't give up yet, working on something." The next morning dawned gray and chilly, a fine mist hanging over the Kentucky landscape. Miguel reported to the main stables as ordered, where Jake Thompson was waiting with poorly concealed satisfaction. "Ramirez," he said, checking his clipboard with exaggerated thoroughness. "You'll be mucking stalls in the yearling barn, 2 through 18. When you're done, the feed room needs sweeping." It was the most menial work on the farm, usually assigned to new hires or as punishment. Miguel accepted the pitchfork and wheelbarrow without comment and set to work. As he moved from stall to stall, he kept his eyes on the distant recovery stable, wondering what was happening with Midnight. During his lunch break, Luis found him sitting alone behind the feed shed. The older man's face was drawn with concern. "It's not good, mijo," he said without preamble. "The specialist is pushing too hard. Midnight isn't eating, keeps watching the door like he's waiting for you." Miguel's chest tightened. "Can you keep an eye on him for me? Let me know if things get worse." Luis nodded. "All of us are watching. Nobody likes what's happening." In the afternoon, Miguel found himself assigned to wash buckets, dozens of them, at the far end of the property. He couldn't help feeling that Jake was deliberately keeping him as far from the recovery stable as possible. From a distance, he noticed unusual activity around Midnight's stable, people coming and going, equipment being carried inside. His concern growing, Miguel finished his work quickly and tried to make his way toward the recovery area, only to be intercepted by one of Jake's assistants. "Thompson says you're needed in the equipment shed," the young man said, though he had the grace to look embarrassed about it. Through the stable grapevine, word reached Miguel that Dr. Williams had introduced a systematic desensitization protocol for Midnight. In practice, this meant forcing the stallion to confront his fears repeatedly, using restraints when necessary. The methods were technically approved by certain schools of equine behavioral modification, but they bore no resemblance to the patient, relationship-based approach Miguel had been using. That evening, April met Miguel at a small diner off the farm property. Her face was tense with worry as she slid into the booth across from him. "It's worse than we thought," she said, keeping her voice low despite the relative privacy. "Dad's planning to sell Midnight right after the Derby weekend demonstration. I found the contract on his desk, $4 million from Sheikh Al-Fayed." Miguel's hand tightened around his water glass. $4 million? That's twice what Midnight was worth even at the height of his racing career, April finished. "The Sheikh isn't just buying a horse, he's buying the story, the miracle recovery. Dad's selling the Whitfield method as part of the package." "But Midnight isn't recovered," Miguel protested. "Not fully. He's still sensitive to loud noises. Still needs careful handling." April nodded grimly. "Which is why Dr. Williams has been instructed to make him appear recovered by any means necessary. The demonstration needs to be perfect." For the next 3 days, Miguel was kept far from the recovery stable during regular hours. He watched from a distance as a parade of veterinarians, specialists, and photographers came and went. Each glimpse he caught of Midnight, being led out briefly for photographs or visible through a distant window, showed a horse that appeared increasingly agitated, his head held high with tension, his movements jerky and uncertain. Luis continued to provide updates, each more concerning than the last. "They put him in cross ties today," he reported one evening. He panicked, almost pulled the post out of the ground. The doctor just called it resistance to be overcome. Unable to bear it any longer, Miguel decided to risk a nighttime visit. With Luis's help, he slipped back onto the property after midnight, using the employee access code the older man provided. The farm was eerily quiet, moonlight casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. The recovery stable was dark except for the dim safety lights that remained on overnight. Miguel moved silently down the aisle until he reached Midnight's stall. What he saw made his heart sink. The proud stallion stood with his head hanging low, a posture of defeat rather than relaxation. When Miguel softly called his name, Midnight's head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the familiar voice. A soft nickering sound, questioning, hopeful, broke the silence. "Si, amigo, it's me," Miguel whispered, sliding the stall door open and slipping inside. Midnight approached cautiously, as if afraid to believe Miguel had returned. When the boy raised his hand, the stallion pressed his muzzle against it with such naked relief that Miguel felt tears burning behind his eyes. "What have they done to you?" he murmured, running his hand along Midnight's neck, feeling the tension in the powerful muscles. New marks showed where restraints had been applied, not wounds exactly, but areas where the hair had been rubbed thin. For nearly an hour, Miguel sat on the straw-covered floor, Midnight standing beside him, head lowered to remain in contact. Miguel sang softly, the same lullabies he'd used in their early sessions, feeling the gradual release of tension in the stallion's body. When it was time to leave, Midnight became agitated, following Miguel to the stall door with anxious steps. "I'll come back," Miguel promised, though he wasn't sure how he could keep that vow. The following day, as Miguel cleaned tack in the main stable, April found him with news. "The investors from Dubai and Japan arrive tomorrow," she said, her voice tense. "Dad scheduled the demonstration for noon on Saturday, a special preview before the Derby." "How's Midnight?" Miguel asked immediately. April's expression told him everything before she spoke. Dr. Williams recommended sedation for the final training sessions. Dad approved it. Miguel felt as if he'd been struck. Sedation? That's not rehabilitation. That's deception. I know, but they're determined to make him appear docile for the demonstration. That night, Miguel couldn't sleep. He paced the small confines of the trailer, his mind racing. Everything he'd worked for, everything Midnight had struggled to overcome, was being sacrificed for profit and prestige. By morning, he'd made a decision. Using his regular ID badge, Miguel arrived at the farm earlier than usual, before the main staff reported for duty. The security guard waved him through without question, just another worker starting his day. Instead of reporting to the main stables, Miguel headed directly for the administrative offices in the main house. The building was quiet, most of the staff not yet arrived. Miguel had cleaned these offices enough times to know that Richard rarely locked his door, a privilege of power in a place where everyone knew better than to intrude. Today, that arrogance would work against him. Richard's office was empty, the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows onto the mahogany desk. Miguel moved quickly to the filing cabinet where April had indicated the veterinary records were kept. Within minutes, he found what he was looking for. Dr. Williams's treatment protocol for Midnight, complete with detailed sedation instructions for the demonstration. The document was explicit. Midnight was to receive a maintenance dose of acepromazine at 6 that morning, followed by a larger dose 2 hours before the demonstration, enough to render him compliant but still able to perform basic movements. It was all there in clinical language, the deliberate chemical subjugation of an animal being presented as rehabilitated. Miguel photographed the documents with his phone, his hands shaking with anger. As he was replacing the file, he heard footsteps in the hallway. He barely managed to close the drawer and step away from the cabinet when the door opened. Richard Whitfield stood in the doorway, surprise quickly transforming into cold fury on his face. "What the hell are you doing in my office, Ramirez?" Miguel straightened his shoulders. "I know about the sedation plan for Midnight. That's not rehabilitation. It's fraud." Richard's expression shifted, calculation replacing anger. "You're out of your depth, boy. What happens to my horses is my business." "Not when you're abusing them to cover up insurance fraud," Miguel countered. "The investors think they're seeing a successfully rehabilitated horse, not a drugged one." Something dangerous flickered in Richard's eyes. "You have exactly one chance to walk away from this. Return to your assigned duties. Forget what you think you know, and we'll pretend this never happened." Miguel stood his ground. "I can't do that. What you're doing to Midnight is wrong." "Wrong?" Richard laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "This is business. That horse is my property, as is everything on this farm. Your sentimentality is costing me money and time." "He's not just property. He's a living being who's been through trauma." Richard moved to his desk, pressing a button on his phone. "Security to the main office, please, immediately." Within minutes, 2 security guards appeared. Richard's voice was cold as ice as he issued instructions. "Mr. Ramirez is no longer employed by Whitfield Farm. Escort him to the gate, ensure he surrenders his ID badge, and make certain he understands that returning to the property will be considered trespassing." The guards flanked Miguel, their expressions uncomfortable but resolute. As they led him through the stable yard, workers stopped to watch. Luis stepped forward, concern etched on his weathered face. "Miguel, what's happening?" "Mr. Ramirez has been terminated," one guard answered before Miguel could speak. Luis's eyes met Miguel's, a silent question passing between them. Miguel gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the recovery stable, a message Luis understood immediately. The walk to the main gate felt like a funeral procession. Grooms, exercise riders, and stable hands watched in silence, many with expressions of sympathy or concern. When they reached the gate, Miguel surrendered his badge without protest. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, kid," the older guard said quietly. "Whitfield isn't someone you want as an enemy." Miguel stood on the dusty road outside the wrought iron gates, his few belongings stuffed into his backpack, watching as the guards returned to their posts. The massive farm stretched before him, rolling pastures and pristine fences, gleaming stables and manicured gardens, a kingdom built on wealth and privilege where people like him were disposable. As he turned to begin the long walk home, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from April. "Don't give up. I have a plan. The Derby weekend could be the end of my father's reign, if we have the courage to risk everything." Miguel stared at April's message, the phone's glow illuminating his face in the gathering dusk. "Don't give up. I have a plan. The Derby weekend could be the end of my father's reign, if we have the courage to risk everything." The weight of those words settled on his shoulders as he pocketed the phone and began the long walk home. Each step down the dusty road took him farther from midnight, yet the bond between them remained unbroken, a tether of trust that transcended physical distance. The trailer was dark and silent when Miguel finally arrived, the emptiness amplifying Carmen's absence. He flipped on the single overhead light, its harsh fluorescence revealing the stack of unpaid medical bills on the kitchen table. He sat heavily in a chair, pulling the bills toward him with a growing sense of despair. The numbers blurred before his eyes. Hundreds, thousands of dollars in treatments, medications, hospital stays. Without his job at Whitfield Farm, without the insurance it provided, how would they survive? More importantly, how would Carmen get the care she needed? A familiar tightness gripped his chest, making it difficult to breathe. For the first time since his parents' accident, Miguel allowed himself to cry. Not quiet tears, but wrenching sobs that bent him double, grief and rage and helplessness pouring out in equal measure. When the storm finally passed, he wiped his face with his sleeve and reached for his phone. There were 3 missed calls from Luis and a text from the hospital reminding him of Carmen's discharge scheduled for tomorrow morning. Reality couldn't be outrun. Decisions needed to be made, actions taken. After a fitful night's sleep, Miguel arrived at St. Joseph's Hospital just as the morning shift nurses were beginning their rounds. Carmen sat on the edge of her bed, already dressed in the clothes he had brought her the previous day, her small suitcase packed beside her. "You look terrible, mijo," were her first words, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance. "Rough night," Miguel replied, forcing a smile as he picked up her suitcase. Carmen waited until they were in the taxi heading home before speaking again. "Dime la verdad, Miguel. What really happened at the farm?" The taxi driver's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, momentarily curious before returning to the road. Miguel hesitated, then found himself telling Carmen everything. The insurance fraud, his dismissal, Midnight's mistreatment, all of it spilling out in a torrent of frustration and worry. Carmen listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When he finished, expecting her to chide him for losing a good job, she surprised him. "Some injustices we cannot accept, even when we are poor," she said firmly. "Your parents would be proud of you standing up for what is right." "But what about your medications? The insurance?" Miguel asked, gesturing helplessly. Carmen's smile was tinged with sadness. "We survived before Whitfield. We will survive after. Dios proveerá. God will provide." Back at the trailer, Miguel helped Carmen settle in, arranging her medications on the kitchen table. The sheer number of pill bottles made his stomach clench, prescriptions they now had no way to afford. Just after noon, his phone buzzed with a text from April. "Meet me at Martha's Diner at 2, bringing something important." Martha's Diner sat just outside Lexington city limits, far enough from Whitfield Farm to be neutral territory. Miguel arrived early, choosing a booth in the back with a clear view of the entrance. April arrived precisely at 2, carrying a sleek laptop under her arm, her expression a mixture of determination and nervous energy. "I've been working on this for weeks," she said without preamble, opening the computer and turning it to face Miguel. "It's nearly finished." On the screen, Miguel saw footage of himself with Midnight, their early sessions when the stallion stood defensive in the corner, the gradual building of trust, moments of breakthrough captured from various angles. April had compiled a documentary, professionally edited with dates and timestamps clearly visible. "I've been recording everything since the beginning," she explained, clicking through various segments. I had a feeling Dad might try to take credit if your methods worked. The contrast was stark between the early footage of Miguel's patient, relationship-based approach and later clips showing Dr. Williams's aggressive methods. One particularly disturbing sequence showed Midnight panicking in cross ties while the specialist continued pushing forward despite clear signs of distress. "This is incredible," Miguel said, emotion tightening his throat. "But what good does it do now? Your father has already pushed me out." April leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've invited independent journalists to the Derby weekend demonstration, people who aren't in my father's pocket. And I've contacted Dr. Eleanor Chen from the Equine Behavior Institute. She's a critic of forced rehabilitation methods. If they see this documentary, then witness the sedated demonstration. Your father will be exposed," Miguel finished, understanding dawning. "But April, that could destroy your relationship with him." She shrugged, though Miguel could see the cost reflected in her eyes. Some things matter more than family loyalty. What he's doing is wrong. To Midnight, to you, to all the horses that would be subjected to these methods if the Whitfield Protocol becomes industry standard. As they continued discussing details, Miguel's phone buzzed with a text from Luis. "They're planning to sedate Midnight tomorrow morning. First dose light, final heavy dose just before demonstration." A cold knot formed in Miguel's stomach. They had less time than he thought. That evening, Miguel made his way to Hope Stables, the small rescue operation where he had volunteered before Whitfield. Martha Gonzalez was in the feed room, measuring out portions for the rescued horses in her care. "Miguel!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "It's been too long, mijo." The familiar surroundings, the worn but clean stalls, the contented horses, the absence of pretension, settled something in Miguel's spirit. This was what horsemanship should be: respectful, genuine, compassionate. He poured out the whole story to Martha, who listened with growing indignation. When he finished, she set down the feed scoop with determination. "That poor horse," she said, "and poor you. But you know, sometimes the universe has ways of bringing injustice to light." "That's what I'm hoping," Miguel replied. "April has a plan, but I'm worried it won't be enough. Whitfield has so much power, so many connections." Martha studied him thoughtfully. "When I first met you, you were a quiet boy grieving his parents. Now look at you, standing up to one of the most powerful men in Kentucky horse racing." She squeezed his shoulder. "Your mother had the same backbone. She never backed down when she saw wrongdoing, even when it cost her." The mention of his mother sparked a memory. Elena Ramirez, calmly facing down a farm manager who had ordered a lame horse back to work. "Some horses, like some people, need defenders," she had told Miguel afterward, "because they cannot speak for themselves." Miguel left Hope Stables with renewed determination and practical advice from Martha, who had decades of experience with equine behavior and local horse politics. She even offered to attend the demonstration as a professional observer, another set of credible eyes to witness whatever transpired. At a small Mexican restaurant on the outskirts of town, Miguel met with Luis and 3 other Whitfield workers who had supported him. The men greeted him with respect that bordered on deference, a notable change from his early days at the farm. "We have a network now," Luis explained, gesturing to the others. "Eyes and ears everywhere on the farm. Nothing happens that we don't know about." One of the younger men, Javier, nodded eagerly. "Even the security guards talked to us. One of them felt bad about escorting you out." "What can I do?" Miguel asked. "I can't get back on the property without trespassing." Luis smiled slightly. "Derby weekend changes everything. Security will be focused on VIPs, checking guest lists. The service entrances will be busy with deliveries, extra staff. Confusion creates opportunity." They spent the next hour planning, each man offering insights into farm operations and security patterns. By the time they finished their meal, a rough strategy had emerged, risky but possible. "Remember," Luis said as they parted, "Somos comunidad. We are community. You stood up for Midnight when no one else would. Now we stand with you." Walking home under a star-filled Kentucky sky, Miguel felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. The odds were stacked against them. Richard Whitfield's wealth and influence against a handful of marginalized workers, and his own disgraced daughter. Yet there was power in truth, in the unbreakable bond he'd formed with Midnight, in the community that had rallied around him. Back at the trailer, Miguel found Carmen sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through old photographs by the light of a single lamp. She looked up as he entered, immediately sensing the change in his demeanor. "You've made a decision," she said. It wasn't a question. Miguel nodded, sitting across from her. "I can't abandon Midnight. What they're doing to him, it would destroy everything we built together. His trust, his progress. They're treating it all as a commodity to be bought and sold." Carmen selected a photograph and pushed it across the table. In it, a much younger Miguel sat atop a gentle mare, his parents standing proudly on either side. "Your father used to say that horses remember the truth in our hearts better than people do. If that magnificent animal trusts you, there's a reason. But fighting Whitfield could cost us everything, abuela. The little we have left." Carmen's gaze was steady, her voice firm despite the wheeze in her breathing. "Some fights choose us, mijo. Your parents would tell you the same." On the eve of Derby weekend, as Miguel studied a map of Whitfield Farm that Luis had provided, marking service entrances and blind spots in the security coverage, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Ramirez," said a gruff voice when he answered. "It's Jake Thompson." Miguel froze, surprised to hear from Whitfield's head trainer, a man who had made no secret of his disdain. "I don't know why I'm doing this," Jake continued, his voice low as if afraid of being overheard. "But they're planning to sedate Midnight tomorrow morning. And it's not a normal dosage. It's enough to practically comatose him for the demonstration. It'll destroy him, Ramirez. Even I can see that's wrong." "I don't know why I'm doing this," Jake continued, his voice low as if afraid of being overheard. "But they're planning to sedate Midnight tomorrow morning. And it's not a normal dosage. It's enough to practically comatose him for the demonstration. It'll destroy him, Ramirez. Even I can see that's wrong." Miguel gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles whitening. "Why are you telling me this?" A long pause stretched between them. "I've worked with horses my whole life," Jake finally said. "What they're doing crosses a line, that's all." The connection ended abruptly. Miguel stared at the phone, the unexpected alliance leaving him momentarily stunned. Then he sprang into action, sending rapid texts to April and Luis with this critical information. The Derby weekend had arrived, and they now had less than 12 hours to save Midnight. Dawn broke over Lexington in a spectacular fusion of pink and gold, the kind of perfect spring morning that brought thousands to Kentucky for the racing season. By 6:30, the roads leading to Churchill Downs were already clogging with traffic, limousines, and luxury SUVs carrying racing's elite to their reserved boxes and exclusive parties. Miguel stood at the bus stop 2 blocks from Whitfield Farm, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wore dark jeans and a blue service shirt Luis had provided, similar enough to the catering uniforms that he might pass casual inspection. In his backpack, a change of clothes, Dr. Martha's veterinary credentials, and a small bottle containing a substance that might counteract some of the sedative's effects. "Remember," Martha had told him the previous night, pressing the bottle into his hand, "this won't completely reverse acepromazine, but it might bring him back from total sedation to mild. It's his best chance." The farm's entrance was transformed. Where usually only employees and occasional visitors passed through the wrought iron gates, today a steady stream of luxury vehicles rolled down the tree-lined drive. Security guards in crisp uniforms checked credentials against tablets, but their attention was focused on the main entrance, the service road that curved behind the main house, where deliveries and staff typically entered, was experiencing its own controlled chaos. As Miguel approached on foot, he spotted 3 catering vans being inspected near the service entrance. Waitstaff in uniforms similar to his were unloading trays and equipment, directed by harried coordinators with clipboards. He waited until a particularly large group was waved through, then fell in step with them, head down, moving with purpose. "You new guy," a supervisor called, pointing at Miguel. His heart froze. "Help with those champagne flutes. They go to the main pavilion." Miguel nodded, relieved, and grabbed a crate of glassware. He was in. The farm was transformed from working horse operation to showcase venue. White tents dotted the manicured grounds, crystal chandeliers hanging impossibly from their peaks. Flower arrangements taller than Miguel adorned entrance tables. The scents of roses and expensive perfume mingled with the underlying earthiness of the stables. Staff bustled everywhere, creating perfect cover for Miguel to move through the property. From his vantage point near the main pavilion, he could see Richard Whitfield holding court with a group of men in expensive suits, gesturing expansively toward the demonstration ring that had been constructed overnight. "The centerpiece of our innovation showcase," Richard was saying, "will be Midnight Thunder's remarkable rehabilitation. A horse many experts declared permanently damaged, now responding beautifully to our proprietary techniques." Miguel's stomach turned at the practiced charm in Richard's voice. He set down his crate and moved purposefully toward the recovery stable, careful to avoid Jake Thompson and security personnel who might recognize him. When he reached the back entrance to the recovery stable, Luis was waiting, ostensibly sweeping the walkway. "Está sedado," Luis whispered without looking up. "They gave him the first dose 30 minutes ago. Dr. Williams and 2 assistants are with him now." "April?" "In position. The journalists and specialists she invited have arrived as guests of Whitfield's business partner. They don't know why they're really here yet." Miguel nodded, his resolve hardening. "I need a distraction in about 10 minutes. Luis smiled slightly. Coincidentally, there might be a problem with the water main near the main house around that time. Very unfortunate timing. Inside the recovery stable, the usual morning sounds were absent. No feed carts rattling, no hoses running, no gentle nickering from stalls. The demonstration had altered all normal routines. Miguel slipped silently down the center aisle, pausing at the sound of voices from Midnight's stall. "He's still not completely under," a man's voice, Dr. Williams, said with irritation. "We may need to increase the second dose." "Mr. Whitfield was clear about timing," another voice responded. "Final administration at 11:30, not before." Miguel retreated into an empty stall, waiting as the men exited, arguing about dosages and schedules. When their voices faded, he moved quickly to Midnight's stall. The sight that greeted him broke his heart. The proud stallion stood with his head hanging unnaturally low, his powerful legs slightly splayed as if struggling to maintain balance. Midnight's eyes, usually so expressive, were half-lidded and dull, his lower lip slack. "Oh, amigo," Miguel whispered, entering the stall. "What have they done to you?" At the sound of Miguel's voice, something flickered in Midnight's drugged state. His ear twitched, turning slightly toward the familiar sound, but the movement was sluggish, impaired. Miguel approached slowly, placing his hand gently on Midnight's neck. The horse's coat was damp with sweat despite the cool morning, his breathing shallow. This wasn't the calm relaxation of a horse at ease. This was chemical suppression of a magnificent spirit. A distant commotion erupted, shouts and the sound of rushing water. Luis's distraction was right on time. Miguel worked quickly, retrieving Martha's bottle from his backpack. The liquid inside needed to be administered under the tongue for fastest absorption, a challenging task with a sedated horse. "I need you to work with me," Miguel murmured, gently using his thumb to part Midnight's lips. The horse offered no resistance, a troubling sign of how heavily drugged he was. Miguel carefully administered the drops under Midnight's tongue, then massaged the area gently to encourage absorption. "It won't completely counteract what they gave you," he explained softly, "but it might help you come back to yourself a little." For several minutes, nothing seemed to change. Midnight remained in the same drugged stance, barely responsive. Miguel's heart sank. Had he been too late? Was the sedation too powerful for Martha's remedy to effect? Then, almost imperceptibly, Midnight's breathing deepened. One ear flicked fully forward, then the other. His eyes, though still glazed, seemed to focus slightly as they found Miguel's face. "That's it," Miguel encouraged, his voice thick with emotion. "Find your way back, amigo." A soft vibration in Midnight's throat, not quite a nicker, but an attempt at one, confirmed that the horse was fighting through the chemical fog. Miguel continued talking softly, reminding Midnight of their time together, of the trust they had built. Footsteps in the aisle sent Miguel diving behind a stack of hay bales moments before Dr. Williams returned, accompanied by another man in a lab coat. Miguel watched through a gap as they examined Midnight. "He seems more alert than he should be," Dr. Williams observed with a frown. "We may need to adjust the second dose upward." "Mr. Whitfield was explicit about the timing," the assistant repeated. "The Sheikh and Mr. Nakamura are already asking questions about the methods. We can't risk Midnight appearing overly sedated." When they left to consult with Richard, Miguel emerged from hiding. Midnight's condition had improved marginally. His head was slightly higher, his stance more stable, but he was still heavily affected by the sedation. Miguel's phone vibrated with a text from April. Positioned near the demonstration ring. Journalists and Dr. Chen are seated in the third row. Dad scheduled Midnight's presentation for 12 noon exactly. "How is he?" Miguel replied grimly. "Heavily sedated but fighting it. They're planning a second dose at 11:30. The response came immediately. "I'll stall the second dose. Get to the demonstration ring by 11:45. Be ready." For the next hour, Miguel remained with Midnight, speaking softly, occasionally singing the lullabies that had first built their connection. Gradually, the stallion became more responsive, though still far from his normal self. When Midnight managed to turn his head and gently press his muzzle against Miguel's chest, their familiar gesture of trust, tears sprang to the boy's eyes. "We're going to fix this," he promised, stroking the velvety muzzle. "Somehow." At 11:30, April's voice echoed through the stable, accompanied by several others. "And this is our recovery facility," she was saying loudly, clearly for Miguel's benefit. "Father, these investors from Colorado are particularly interested in your rehabilitation protocols." Miguel recognized the diversion and slipped out through the rear door just as the group entered from the front. Outside, the farm grounds had transformed into a full-scale spectacle. Hundreds of elegantly dressed guests mingled on manicured lawns, champagne flutes glinting in the spring sunshine. A string quartet played near the demonstration ring, which had been decorated with blue and gold bunting, Whitfield farm colors. Luis intercepted Miguel near the equipment shed. "They're bringing Midnight out in 10 minutes. April stopped the second sedation. Said her father wanted the horse alert enough to demonstrate real responses." Miguel nodded grimly. "I need to get near that ring without being spotted." "Already arranged," Luis replied, handing him a wide-brimmed groundskeeper's hat. "Javier and Eduardo are creating a blind spot near the east entrance. Security will be focused on the VIP section opposite." The demonstration ring buzzed with anticipation as Miguel positioned himself behind a decorative arrangement of hay bales and flowers near the east entrance. From his vantage point, he could see Richard Whitfield in an immaculate suit, chatting with two men whose expensive watches and commanding presence marked them as the international investors, Sheikh Al-Fayed and Mr. Nakamura. April moved purposefully among the guests, laptop tucked under her arm, occasionally making eye contact with individuals Miguel assumed were the independent journalists and specialists she had invited. Dr. Martha Gonzalez had also arrived, her veterinary credentials hanging around her neck, positioning herself near the ring's entrance. At precisely 11:50, a ripple of interest moved through the crowd as Dr. Williams appeared, leading Midnight toward the demonstration ring. The stallion moved with uncharacteristic docility, his steps measured and mechanical, head lower than natural. To untrained eyes, he might appear calm, but Miguel could see the artificial nature of his movement, the vacancy still lingering in his eyes despite the partial counteraction of the sedative. Richard stepped to the center of the ring, microphone in hand, his voice carrying easily over the quieting crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome to Whitfield Farms Innovation Showcase. Today, we present the culmination of months of groundbreaking work in equine rehabilitation." As Richard launched into his carefully crafted narrative about the Whitfield method, Miguel watched Midnight closely. The stallion stood unnaturally still beside Dr. Williams, occasionally blinking slowly, fighting the sedation that still coursed through his system. 3 years ago, Midnight Thunder was our champion, Richard continued, gesturing toward the black stallion. After a tragic accident claimed his jockey's life, Midnight was considered permanently traumatized, aggressive, dangerous, unreachable. Experts declared him a lost cause. Miguel's hands clenched into fists as Richard described a rehabilitation process that bore no resemblance to the patient, relationship-based approach that had actually reached Midnight. Through our systematic, scientifically developed protocols, Richard declared, we've accomplished what many considered impossible, the complete rehabilitation of a severely traumatized thoroughbred. Dr. Williams began demonstrating with Midnight, asking for basic movements that the sedated horse performed with mechanical compliance. The audience applauded, impressed by the apparent transformation of the once dangerous animal. Miguel looked across the ring and caught April's eye. She nodded once, decisively, and stepped forward, her laptop open and connected to the large screens that had been erected for the demonstration. This was it, the moment of truth. Miguel took a deep breath and walked directly into the center of the ring, ignoring the security guards who immediately moved toward him, his voice rising above the sudden murmurs of confusion. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Miguel Ramirez, and I need to tell you the truth about Midnight Thunder before it's too late. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Miguel Ramirez, and I need to tell you the truth about Midnight Thunder before it's too late. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the elegant crowd. Richard Whitfield's face transformed from polished confidence to cold fury in an instant. 2 security guards moved toward Miguel, but froze when April stepped forward, her laptop now connected to the massive screens that flanked the demonstration ring. This horse has been heavily sedated for today's demonstration, Miguel continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. What you're seeing isn't rehabilitation, it's chemical restraint designed to mimic healing that hasn't been allowed to happen naturally. Richard recovered quickly, his smile returning though it didn't reach his eyes. I apologize for this interruption. This young man is a former employee who was dismissed for incompetence. Security, please remove him. As the guards resumed their approach, April's voice cut through the tension. Before anyone is removed, I believe our guests deserve to see the full story. She pressed a key on her laptop, and the screens flickered to life. The footage was devastating in its clarity. Side-by-side comparisons showed Miguel's patient, relationship-based approach contrasted with Dr. Williams's aggressive methods. Timestamps and dates were clearly visible, establishing the chronology beyond dispute. Most damning was the footage from that very morning. Midnight receiving injections, his demeanor changing from alert to artificially subdued. Richard lunged toward April. Turn that off immediately. Is this true, Mr. Whitfield? Sheikh Al-Fayed stood, his expression grave. Has this animal been sedated for our benefit? The momentum shifted palpably as several people rose from their seats. The independent journalists and specialists April had invited. A woman stepped forward, her credentials identifying her as Dr. Eleanor Chen from the Equine Behavior Institute. As an expert in equine trauma recovery, I can state unequivocally that this horse shows clear signs of chemical sedation, not natural rehabilitation, she announced, her professional authority lending weight to Miguel's claims. Richard's carefully constructed narrative was collapsing before his eyes. He turned to Dr. Williams, clearly seeking support, but the specialist was already backing away, unwilling to stake his professional reputation on an increasingly untenable position. In the chaos that followed, Miguel approached Midnight. The stallion's eyes, still dulled by medication, nonetheless tracked his movement. When Miguel reached out his hand, Midnight extended his muzzle toward it, a gesture that, even in his compromised state, demonstrated recognition and trust. Senor Nakamura, Miguel said, addressing the Japanese investor directly. In my culture, we have a saying, La verdad siempre sale a la luz. The truth always comes to light. This horse doesn't need to be broken or controlled. He needs to be understood. The distinguished investor approached slowly, studying both Miguel and Midnight with keen interest. In Japan, We have a concept called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken objects with gold, making them more beautiful and valuable after being repaired. This is what I see here. Two broken souls creating something more precious than the original. Sheikh Al-Fayed joined them, his expression unreadable. Young man, how would you demonstrate your connection with this horse if he were not sedated? Miguel met the Sheikh's gaze steadily. I would simply ask for his cooperation, not demand it. Trust cannot be forced or fabricated. A convenient claim when the horse is clearly drugged, Richard interjected desperately. Dr. Martha stepped forward. The sedation can be partially counteracted. I've already administered a mild antagonist earlier, which is why the horse is responding at all. With your permission, I can administer another dose that would bring him closer to his natural state. After a moment's consideration, Sheikh Al-Fayed nodded. Proceed. I wish to see the truth, whatever it may be. Under the watchful eyes of hundreds of guests, Dr. Martha administered a second dose of the counteragent. For several long minutes, nothing seemed to change. Midnight stood in the same position, head lowered, eyes half closed. Miguel remained beside him, speaking softly in Spanish, words meant only for the horse's ears. Then, gradually, Midnight's breathing deepened. His head lifted slightly, ears moving with more natural alertness. His eyes, those expressive windows that Miguel had come to know so well, began to clear, focus returning like the sun emerging from behind clouds. He's coming back, Miguel whispered, emotion thickening his voice. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or complete. The sedatives were too powerful to be fully counteracted, but it was enough. Midnight's natural personality began to reassert itself, his movements becoming more fluid, less mechanical. When he turned his head to look directly at Miguel, recognition flashed unmistakably in his eyes. What would you do now, if you were demonstrating your methods? Sheikh Al-Fayed asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Miguel considered for a moment, then did something that caused gasps throughout the audience. He sat down cross-legged in the center of the ring, turning his back to Midnight, and began to sing softly. It was the same lullaby he had used in their first sessions. A la puerta del cielo. Confusion rippled through the crowd. This was not what anyone expected. No commands, no equipment, not even eye contact. Just a boy sitting with his back to a horse that had once been labeled dangerous, singing as if they were alone together. For nearly a minute, Midnight remained where he was, still fighting the effects of the sedation. Then, with halting steps that grew more confident with each movement, the great black stallion approached Miguel from behind. The audience held its collective breath as Midnight lowered his head until his muzzle nearly touched Miguel's shoulder, the position of trust they had established months ago. Remarkable, Dr. Chen murmured, documenting the interaction. The horse is initiating contact on his own terms. Sheikh Al-Fayed turned to Richard, who stood ashen-faced at the edge of the ring. Mr. Whitfield, you promised us a demonstration of innovative rehabilitation techniques. It seems we are indeed seeing one, just not from the source you claimed. Mr. Nakamura nodded in agreement. In business, as in horsemanship, trust is the foundation of all valuable relationships. When trust is broken, he left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Throughout the demonstration ring, phones and cameras captured every moment. April's documentary continued to play on the screens, providing context for what the audience was witnessing live. The narrative had shifted irrevocably, no longer a story of Whitfield innovation, but one of deception exposed and genuine healing demonstrated. Richard, seeing his carefully constructed empire of influence crumbling, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. This is all very touching, but ultimately irrelevant. Midnight Thunder is my property. Whatever methods worked to rehabilitate him belonged to Whitfield Farm. This boy was merely following our protocols. That's not true, Luis called out, stepping forward with several other Latino and African-American workers. We all witnessed Miguel develop his own approach from the beginning. Mr. Whitfield tried to force traditional methods that failed repeatedly. The community of workers that had formed around Miguel now stood publicly with him, their testimonies adding further weight to the truth being revealed. Sheikh Al-Fayed stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Mr. Whitfield, I came here prepared to invest millions in your breeding program and this rehabilitation method you claim to have pioneered. Now I find myself questioning not only this presentation but the integrity of your entire operation." Richard paled visibly as the full implications of the morning's events dawned on him. His reputation in the close-knit world of thoroughbred breeding, his standing with international investors, the lucrative contracts that had seemed assured, all were now in jeopardy. "Perhaps," Mr. Nakamura suggested quietly, "we should discuss a different arrangement, one that recognizes the true innovation we've witnessed today." As the formal demonstration dissolved into intense discussions among the investors, journalists, and specialists, Miguel remained with Midnight. The stallion was still not fully himself, but with each passing minute, more of his natural spirit returned. He stayed close to Miguel, occasionally pressing his muzzle against the boy's shoulder or arm, seeking reassurance in the chaos surrounding them. April approached, her expression a complex mixture of triumph and uncertainty. "You did it," she said simply. "You changed everything." Miguel shook his head. "We did it, all of us together." He glanced at Luis and the other workers who had risked their livelihoods to stand with him, at Dr. Martha who had provided the means to counteract the sedation, at April herself who had documented everything from the beginning. "What happens now?" Miguel asked, one hand resting on Midnight's neck. April looked toward where her father stood, engaged in intense conversation with Sheikh Al-Fayed, Mr. Nakamura, and several lawyers who had materialized from the crowd. "I'm not sure," she admitted, "but I know it won't be what my father planned." The Sheikh and Mr. Nakamura are furious about the deception, but they're also businessmen who recognize value when they see it. And what you demonstrated today has tremendous value, ethical rehabilitation that actually works. As they spoke, Richard broke away from the group and approached Miguel, his expression unreadable. For a moment, tension hung in the air between them. The powerful farm owner and the young Latino groom who had publicly challenged his authority. "My investors," Richard began, his voice carefully controlled, "are proposing a restructuring of our agreement. They're suggesting the creation of a dedicated rehabilitation program here at Whitfield Farm, with you as director." The words seemed to physically pain him. "With a full scholarship to study veterinary medicine at the University of Kentucky while you continue your work." Miguel blinked in surprise. "Why would you agree to that?" Richard's smile was tight. "Because the alternative is watching them walk away with their millions to fund your methods elsewhere. I'm a businessman, Ramirez. I recognize when adaptation is necessary for survival." As Richard outlined the proposed arrangement, salary, position, educational opportunities, Miguel realized that this was not a victory born of compassion or moral awakening. Richard Whitfield remained who he had always been, a pragmatic capitalist adapting to protect his interests. The power dynamic had shifted not because Richard had changed, but because other powerful players now recognized value in what Miguel offered. With cameras still recording, Sheikh Al-Fayed approached them. "Mr. Whitfield has explained our proposal. What do you say, young man? Would you be willing to develop your methods under the Whitfield banner, with proper credit and compensation this time?" Miguel looked from the Sheikh to Richard, then to Midnight, who stood calmly beside him despite the crowds and commotion, a testament to their connection that transcended circumstances. With Midnight's future and his grandmother's well-being hanging in the balance, Miguel made his decision. "I would need certain guarantees," he said, meeting Richard's gaze steadily. "Starting with Midnight's future. He stays with me and no breeding until he's psychologically ready. I would need certain guarantees," Miguel said, meeting Richard's gaze steadily. "Starting with Midnight's future. He stays with me and no breeding until he's psychologically ready." 3 months later, the once empty office at the far end of Whitfield Farm's administrative building had transformed. Where sterile white walls had dominated, there were now framed photographs. horses with their caretakers, close-ups of expressive equine eyes, and one central image. Midnight Thunder standing beside Miguel, both facing the camera with a quiet dignity that spoke of their journey together. Miguel sat at his desk, reviewing applications for the fall internship program at what was now officially called the Midnight Recovery Center. The brass plaque outside the door still surprised him each morning when he arrived. Sometimes, when the farm was quiet and dawn was just breaking over the Kentucky hills, he would trace the engraved letters with his fingers, reassuring himself that it wasn't a dream. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. April entered, carrying a thick envelope bearing the University of Kentucky logo. "It's official," she said, placing it before him. "Full scholarship starting this fall. Dad actually pulled all his strings for this one." Miguel opened the envelope with careful fingers, still unused to handling important documents addressed to him. The acceptance letter to the School of Veterinary Medicine felt weighty in his hands. The opportunity it represented almost overwhelming. "I never thought," he began, then shook his head, unable to find words adequate for the moment. April smiled. "You earned this, Miguel. Every bit of it." The journey from that confrontational Derby weekend to this moment had been neither simple nor straightforward. Richard Whitfield, true to his nature, had demanded meticulous contracts that gave Whitfield Farm prominent branding on the recovery program while ensuring Miguel received proper credit and compensation. The negotiations had required lawyers, mediators, and several tense meetings where Sheikh Al-Fayed and Mr. Nakamura made their continued investment contingent upon ethical treatment of both animals and staff. "How's your grandmother settling into the new place?" April asked, leaning against the doorframe. Miguel smiled, remembering Carmen's face when she'd first seen the small but comfortable apartment near the university hospital. "She pretends to miss the trailer, but I caught her showing off her new kitchen to the neighbors yesterday." The sound of hoofbeats outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Luis leading a group of handlers and horses across the yard. The Latino and African American workers who had stood with Miguel now wore uniforms with "Recovery Team" embroidered on the back, a small but significant acknowledgement of their expertise and contribution. "Luis is taking the new arrivals on their orientation walk," Miguel explained. "We got 3 more horses from racing operations last week, all labeled dangerous or unmanageable after accidents." "Any as challenging as Midnight was?" April asked. Miguel shook his head. "Every horse is different. Some have different traumas, different fears. That's what we're teaching the handlers now, to see each horse as an individual with their own story." Later that morning, Miguel walked to the expanded recovery stable, now housed in a renovated barn with spacious stalls and peaceful surroundings. In the central area, Luis was conducting a training session for new staff members, many recruited from the same marginalized communities that had previously been relegated to the most menial positions at Whitfield. "Remember," Luis was saying, his voice carrying the authority of decades of experience, "rushing creates resistance. Patience creates possibility." Miguel smiled at hearing his own words repeated. The older man had become both mentor and student in their new arrangement, contributing wisdom from his years of experience while embracing the innovative approaches Miguel championed. In the last stall of the recovery barn, Midnight Thunder stood watching the activity with alert interest. Unlike his early days of pressing fearfully against back walls, he now moved freely, his curiosity about the world cautiously reawakening. When he spotted Miguel, his ears pricked forward, and a soft nickering sound welcomed his friend. "Buenos dias, amigo," Miguel greeted, entering the stall. Midnight immediately approached, lowering his head to receive the gentle scratch between his eyes that had become their ritual. "Ready for our walk?" Outside, the June sunshine warmed the Kentucky bluegrass, creating perfect conditions for their daily constitutional. Miguel led Midnight without a lead rope, just the two of them walking side by side along the perimeter of Whitfield Farm. These quiet moments together remained sacred, untouched by the business considerations and politics that sometimes dominated their new reality. As they crested a small hill overlooking the main training tracks, Miguel spotted Richard Whitfield observing the morning workouts. Though they now technically worked together, their relationship remained complex. Mutual respect mingled with lingering wariness, like two predators sharing territory through uneasy truce. Richard noticed them and raised a hand in acknowledgement. After a moment's hesitation, Miguel returned the gesture. The older man had surprised him in some ways since the Derby weekend confrontation. While never apologizing directly for his past actions, Richard had followed the letter of their agreement with unexpected thoroughness, perhaps recognizing that the partnership with Miguel now represented significant financial opportunity. "He still doesn't understand us, does he?" Miguel murmured to Midnight as they continued their walk. "To him, everything has a price, a profit margin." Midnight snorted softly, as if in agreement. By late afternoon, Miguel had finished his rounds with the other recovering horses and returned to the main office to complete paperwork for the university enrollment. As he passed through the stable yard, he noticed a sleek black Mercedes parked near the main house. Sheikh Al-Fayed had returned for his monthly visit to check on the program he was now heavily invested in. "The Sheikh is asking for you," April informed him when she spotted him. He brought his daughter this time. In the main conference room, Sheikh Al-Fayed greeted Miguel warmly, introducing his teenage daughter Amara, who had been following the story of Midnight's recovery with great interest. "My daughter has a gift with animals as well," the Sheikh explained. "I thought perhaps she might learn something from your methods." Amara's eyes brightened. "Is it true you sang to Midnight when he was most afraid? Father said you just sat with him for days without trying to touch him." Miguel nodded. "Sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer is space and respect, especially for those who have experienced trauma." The Sheikh watched this exchange with thoughtful eyes. "We are establishing a rehabilitation center in Dubai," he said. "Perhaps when you have completed your studies you might consider consulting with us." The offer, casual yet weighted with implication, represented a future Miguel could never have imagined for himself a year ago. "I'd be honored to consider it," he replied carefully. On Sunday morning, when the farm was quietest, Miguel saddled Midnight for only the third time since their partnership began. Unlike conventional training where riding was introduced early, Miguel had waited months until Midnight himself showed readiness. The saddle was minimal, just enough for balance, and instead of a bit, Miguel used only a simple halter with ropes as reins. They rode slowly through the misty Kentucky morning, past the manicured show pastures, and out to the wilder edges of the property where tall grasses brushed against Midnight's legs. The stallion moved with increasing confidence, his powerful stride finding rhythm as they explored together. This, Miguel reflected, was the true measure of their success. Not the program's growing reputation or the financial investments, but these moments of genuine partnership, freely given on both sides. That afternoon, Miguel drove to a small elementary school in one of Lexington's underserved neighborhoods. As part of the community outreach program he had insisted on including in the Whitfield contract, he visited schools regularly, bringing Midnight to meet children who might otherwise never interact with such magnificent animals. In the school's modest playground, children gathered excitedly as Miguel unloaded Midnight from the specially designed trailer. The stallion, once deemed too dangerous to approach, now stood calmly amid the controlled chaos of 30 enthusiastic children, his eyes alert but peaceful. "This is Midnight Thunder," Miguel introduced, as the children gazed up in awe at the massive black horse. 3 years ago, he was a champion racehorse. Then he had an accident that scared him very badly. A small girl with braided hair raised her hand. "Was he hurt?" "Not on the outside," Miguel explained. "But inside, in his heart and mind, he was very frightened. Sometimes the wounds we can't see take the longest to heal." As Miguel told Midnight's story in child-friendly terms, he watched understanding dawn in young eyes. Many of these children came from challenging circumstances themselves, and the narrative of overcoming fear resonated in ways more sophisticated audiences sometimes missed. "The most important lesson I learned from Midnight," Miguel concluded, "is that everyone deserves a second chance, and sometimes, when it seems we've lost everything, that's exactly when we're about to find our true purpose." After the presentation, Miguel allowed the children to approach Midnight one by one, teaching them how to offer their hands palm up for the horse to sniff. The stallion's gentle acceptance of each child, his willingness to trust despite his history, moved several teachers to tears. As dusk approached, Miguel and Midnight headed back to Whitfield Farm. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, the rolling hills of Kentucky stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Miguel rode bareback now, the connection between them requiring nothing more than mutual trust and the pressure of his legs against Midnight's sides. They galloped across an empty pasture, the physical exertion a joy for both of them after the controlled environments of the day's events. Wind rushed past Miguel's ears, carrying away the lingering politics and complications of their new life, leaving only the essential truth of their bond. When they finally slowed to a walk, both breathing hard from the exertion, Miguel leaned forward, whispering into Midnight's ear, "Gracias, mi amigo, for showing me that even when the world says we're broken beyond repair, the only opinion that truly matters is that of those who see beyond the scars." In the distance, a trailer was approaching the farm entrance, bringing another problem horse that someone had given up on, another soul labeled dangerous or worthless, another opportunity for redemption.